Coming up, the unmatched power of ExxonMobil.
The response that management undertook to the Valdez accident turned it into a place apart among industrial giants in the emphasis on rules and systems.
New America Foundation President Steve Coll discusses Exxon Valdez and the corporate culture and international reach of ExxonMobil. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Our speaker is Steve Coll, who last spoke here when he discussed his wonderful Pulitzer Prize-winning best-selling book, Ghost Wars. Today, he will be discussing his latest book, Private Empire, which is a compelling study about ExxonMobil and American power. Peppered with tales of corporate power, influence, money, and politics, Private Empire reads like a thriller. This is a colossal tale that for anyone interested in corporate America, big business, and what lies behind the oil industry will want to read.
Let me start with a story because it is a story that's critical to understanding the modern shape and culture of ExxonMobil. And that is something that'll be familiar to many of you, but probably an event you haven't thought about much in the last couple of decades, which was what happened on the evening of March 23, 1989, when the Exxon Valdez tanker pulled out of the port in Valdez, Alaska. And the man who was on the bridge of the Valdez was named Joseph Hazelwood, Jr., a graduate of the prestigious New York Maritime College, a man who once scored 138 on an IQ test, who quoted Oscar Wilde and Stonewall Jackson in conversation at his dinner table, and who was drinking. By the time he reached middle age, he said later that he felt he was in some sort of descent. He'd been arrested for driving under the influence a couple of times, but had been allowed to go back to work. And that night in Valdez, as he was waiting for the tanker to load, he had some drinks at the Pipeline Club and walked aboard through a gate that the Coast Guard was meant to police for such things, and was unexamined, walked aboard the ship, and off they went out into the channel. Now, there were icebergs on the sea from the Columbia Glacier, and these were easily visible and not unusual in March. And as they approached the icebergs, they were blocking the outbound lane, and there was a common maneuver to deal with that, which was to secure permission to cross over the inbound traffic, route around the icebergs, and then circle back to the outbound lane. And Hazelwood was on the bridge, and he essentially said to his first mate, "Look, I got a lot of paperwork downstairs. You've done this before. Are you comfortable handling this maneuver?" And the mate said that he was. And Hazelwood left the bridge, which was a violation of company policy, but itself not the world's most unusual thing in these tanker maneuvers. And while he was gone, it's not really clear what happened among the mates on the bridge, but they essentially became disoriented the way pilots sometimes do in a heavy fog. They really just lost track of where they were. And the next thing they knew was the sound, this terrible sound of rock on metal as the ship ran aground on a place called Bly Reef off of Bly Island in the middle of the Sound. And it ripped open the belly of the ship. Hazelwood came charging out of his room and came upstairs and went to the toilet, he later recounted, and threw up, and he said he knew that the world as he had known it had just come to an end. And in an important way, that was true of Exxon as well that night, because the corporation's reputation was so badly damaged by the events that followed. 240,000 barrels spilled into this pristine sea. The amount of wildlife there was truly unusual, and the number of surface mammals who were immediately affected by the oil was also unusual for such a setting. As television disasters go, it was of the first order. Exxon went through a whole series of traumas, business traumas, internal traumas, management traumas associated with this disaster. Its public affairs and political strategy department discovered in focus groups 20 years later that if they did wordplay with folks like yourself and asked someone to respond to a word, whatever came to mind, if they said the word Exxon, most people said Valdez, even 20 years later. Now, the liability, the financial liability that they paid in settlements and in some trials was not that material, but the question of what Exxon should do about what was exposed by this accident became central to the corporation's management culture over the next 10 or 15 years. There was First of all, the drunk driving metaphor was much too simple and really not actually very useful in understanding what had happened. The National Transportation Safety Board did a very thorough examination of what had happened and concluded that a combination of cost-cutting in the federal government, cost-cutting at the Coast Guard, lazy management at the Coast Guard, and cost-cutting at ExxonMobil was really responsible for the accident. It's not even clear that the fact that Hazelwood was drinking was relevant other than that he left the bridge, and if he'd stayed there, maybe there would have been a more skilled pilot. But what Exxon concluded was that the accident was an opportunity, and they had already been responding to the drop in oil prices, volatility in oil prices during the 1980s, and then a return to declining prices in the 1990s by cutting costs. And those cost cuts, I think, also contributed meaningfully to the accident. In 1982, Exxon had 182,000 employees, and it eliminated 80,000 of those jobs by 1989. It's kind of hard to shrink that much without having an impact on operations. Now, Exxon had always been a sort of rule-bound conservative culture compared to other descendants, corporate descendants of Standard Oil. But the response that management undertook to the Valdez accident turned it into a place apart among industrial giants in the emphasis on rules and systems and automated, idiot-proof employee manuals. And the man who oversaw this is the legendary chief executive who came to office in 1993, Lee Raymond, who served as the chief executive of Exxon and then ExxonMobil after the merger in 2000 until his retirement at the end of 2005. He was regarded by his industry peers as the most effective chief executive of his generation among the super majors. He was also, from a writer's perspective, a gift because he was a man who was very comfortable, is still very comfortable in his own skin, very blunt, very direct, tough on people, an absolute monster around the office in the view of many of his employees and managers, though I'm not sure that he recognized the effect that he had on others. But if you were in a meeting of this type and you asked a question and he thought it was dumb, he would tell you that it was the dumbest question that he had heard in a month. If he said in response to a question that he thought was not particularly bright, frankly, that was a pretty good clue to duck if you were at a table or if you were a Wall Street analyst or a reporter. But he had a very strong vision about how he wanted to transform Exxon. He felt the company had become too bureaucratic, as those 182,000 employee counts suggested, too self-protecting, too slow, and that he wanted to remake it into something more agile and leaner and safer and more effective. And he did that through kind of ruthless exercise of his will over the corporation. And one of the areas where he focused was safety. Never again was the mantra that came after the Valdez. And the idea was to install systems that would take the human fallibility out of these operations to the greatest possible extent by automating them, by idiot-proofing them, and by giving everybody the same playbook, no matter where in the world they were. Because ExxonMobil was rapidly evolving, especially after the merger, into a more international company with employees distributed all over the world. The majority of its employees were non-Americans. They would come to the company from their perspectives, and the idea was to give them one manual, and it was literally a series of books that you would have that would tell you what to do in almost every circumstance of your professional day. It is still called the Operations Integrity Management System, OIMS, as it's known to the initiated. And one of the most striking features of it was the safety piece. It became the famous Exxon Safety Minute. Every meeting, no matter what type it was, an accounting meeting, no matter whether it's the same group of managers who worked together every day and they met 3 times a week, every meeting had to start with a safety minute, and the responsibility for giving it rotated, and you were supposed to come up with something fresh each time. So the employees and managers I talked to said their greatest dilemma was driving into work trying to think of something fresh to say about safety that hadn't been said in the previous 175 versions of the meeting. But they would meet in groups and try to get basically accident reports down to 0, which may not always be the same thing as accidents, of course, but to get days lost to accidents down to 0. And that was a shared experience that became a little bit like a 12-step program. You would stand around and confess near misses. If a file drawer was left open, you could be reprimanded in writing because someone might bump their knee on it. Excessive numbers of paper cuts at the copier were investigated by managers, and reports were written about how to prevent that. In order to create a seamless attitude towards safety from home to workplace, managers would talk to each other about mistakes they'd made away from the office that had perhaps jeopardized their ability to come to work. Someone might confess that they were mowing their lawn and that a rock came out and struck them in the leg. Someone might confess that they went to the beach and didn't use enough sunscreen and become sunburned. And the idea was that these attitudes towards preventing injury were 24/7 responsibilities of everyone who worked there and not something that could be isolated in the workplace. Now, Exxon came out of these reforms, bought Mobil, and found itself as the largest oil and gas corporation in the world that was not owned by a government as of about 2000. The coincidence of these reforms in time is that the Cold War ends, the world opens up, but at the same to oil companies in ways that it hadn't been open before. But as that opening occurs, there's also a backlash of nationalism that remains strong and is spreading. And one of the consequences of that is that there are fewer and fewer places in the world where politically you can own oil and gas, especially if you're a big, bad American oil corporation that comes knocking with all the baggage of the American government trailing behind. And one of the consequences of this dilemma has been, in the period over the last 10 or 12 years, and I think it's important to understand because it speaks to the central dilemmas that ExxonMobil faces. If you're ExxonMobil and you want to own oil and gas, and that is emphatically the business model, to book reserves, Wall Street is watching. How many barrels of oil do you claim through geological auditing you own in an equity sense? In today's world, there are really only three places, because of resource nationalism, that you can go. You can go to the free market West, where property rights are sacrosanct and anybody who wins a contract can own property. Well, the problem is that in the free market West, until very recently, there wasn't growth in oil and gas to be discovered. Secondly, you can go to weak states. States that are so weak that they don't really have the capacity to build their own state-owned oil company or to do it themselves, or to force you into a contracting role, or to force you into terms that deprive you of equity ownership. So this has led ExxonMobil and others disproportionately to unstable states in places like West Africa. And then the third element, which sort of blends with the first two, is to go to technological frontiers. So you can create value that state-owned companies in Russia and China simply cannot match still if you can go to the hard places. That means deep water, and that means the Arctic and other harsh climates. So the paradox is, if you think about the conservative culture that was constructed after the Valdez, a culture of rulemaking and tight, idiot-proof management systems, and the pressures, the kind of bet-the-company pressures that come from these kinds of daily operations, on the one hand. On the other hand, the imperative of the business is taking you into higher and higher risk environments. So on the one hand, you're a very conservative, very tightly managed corporation. On the other hand, risk is now your profile. Traveling to Equatorial Guinea, which is this tiny oil-rich island state on the west coast of Africa, I came away from my visit there thinking, the best way to understand this country is just to think of it as a bank waiting to be robbed. I mean, it's 500,000 people producing billions and billions of dollars in cash flow. There's one presidential palace. If you're sitting in the presidential palace, you have the cash flow. And you can approach the presidential palace from the sea and from the harbor, but you got to get there with guns. But once you're there, you own the bank. Really, in many of these countries, the profile is similar. I think another aspect of this change after 1989, apart from the kind of dilemma of risk, is the structure of globalization and what it does to corporations like ExxonMobil and how they think of themselves and how they operate in the world. In the last 10 or 15 years, we've heard many chief executives of global corporations headquartered, privately held or publicly traded corporations headquartered in the West, say in one way or another what Lee Raymond said, but in his characteristic way, more directly than many of his peers might. He was in a meeting where somebody was saying, the U.S. needs refining capacity for energy security. We need more refineries to blend gasoline and fuels than we have. And so really for national security reasons rather than economic ones, it would be a good idea if ExxonMobil, which has the capacity, the financial capacity to do it, would just pursue that project, even if it doesn't quite meet your investment criteria. And he answered, well, I'm not a U.S. company. I don't do things to benefit the government of the United States. Now, people knew what he meant. I mean, he is a U.S. company in a legal sense. He's headquartered in Texas. But of the 80,000 employees, as I mentioned, most of them are non-Americans, and most of them don't work in the United States. Also, while ExxonMobil pays substantial taxes to the United States Treasury, most of the profits it makes are generated overseas. But what's interesting, if you think, why would a corporation like ExxonMobil increasingly see itself as an independent global sovereign? And it does. Its executives are conscious of their independence and of their sovereignty. In relation to the United States government, I came to think, as I researched case study after case study, about how they interacted with the embassy in one country or another, when they called on the United States for help, when they kept their distance, when they rejected American policy in a local setting and pursued their own. I came to think of ExxonMobil as sort of like France. They were mostly aligned with the United States. They were sometimes opposed, but a lot of the time they were just busy keeping track of their own separate system in the world, and really didn't want to be entangled in American power unless it served their interests. This durability, on the one hand, as an American headquartered institution, but this increasing set of incentives to become global and independent, to untether from the American system, I think is a real tension in a world where corporations increasingly matter more than states, where all kinds of entities that are not states matter more than states, and where the relative power of corporations in comparison to states is growing. And so it's very interesting then to reflect on the changing character of these corporations, not just their power and activities. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to your questions.
I was very interested in your starting to talk about this evolving culture at ExxonMobil. How long do you think it will be before ExxonMobil has a non-American woman as chief executive officer?
That is a great question. Yeah. How long will the oil age last? They really struggle with diversity, and they struggle with social change. That is the flaw in the system. There are great strengths to being organized like the Marine Corps. And this is another aspect of their management culture. You spend your life in ExxonMobil, and it's a very rigorous system. You come in, and early on you're reviewed, and if you're in the top 10, you'll go into a pool of other valedictorians, and if you graduate out of that, and after 6 or 7 years you still want to be part of this rulemaking culture, then you're on a track. Now you'll pay a price. You have to move every 3 or 4 years in all likelihood, but you'll be tracked toward leadership. And so when folks get to the very top, they've all grown up together as a cohort. And I think if you took the top 100 American corporations, publicly traded corporations, and you mapped, say, the top 50 jobs at every one of those, you would find in almost every instance, I think every instance, a significant number of those jobs were populated by people who had moved in laterally, say from a competing corporation or from a competing industry. They brought in some fresh perspective, some fresh experience, some new way of thinking about the world. And at ExxonMobil, you wouldn't find that. Just like, if you have a successful career at IBM, that doesn't mean you can move over and be a 2-star general in the Marine Corps. You come up together as a group. And so there's a sort of coherence and cohesion that comes with that, but also self-limiting insularity. And the presence of women and the presence of diverse executives in the upper ranks of ExxonMobil, I haven't done the statistics, but it must be the least diverse performance of any corporation in the top 50, I would imagine. It would be hard to imagine something less diverse. There was a director who came in from another corporation, another industry. He said he was sort of astonished by this culture and trying to figure it out. And he realized at one stage, he said that all of the top 4 or 5 executives who he met only had sons. Not a one of them had daughters. And he had a background in math, and he went home and he tried to do the probability tables, and he said, okay, there is a selection bias here, but what could it be? I mean, is it hunting? Is it, I don't know. And there is, in fact, a hunting culture at the corporation. But, so why does it matter? And, ExxonMobil's response to a lot of these sorts of criticisms or observations from outside is doesn't matter. But I think in this case it does. I think the world, your question implies what kind of a world we're moving into.
There might be, just as there were in the Cold War, and particularly in West African weak states, two competing models, the Exxon model and the Chinese business model. What can you tell us about that competition and what may emerge from it?
I think that where the edge of the competition lies now is that the Chinese companies, on the one hand, are less efficient, less technologically capable than the northern Western companies. But the gap is closing because they're acquiring IP and they're acquiring experience and they're driving in a certain direction. The direction certainly would seem to be one of improvement, notwithstanding the self-limited problems that come with being a state-owned enterprise in which the state is essentially a party, and these Chinese companies do suffer from the crazy, disorienting effects of politicized control, feather bedding, and all of the strange, often opaque relationships that the party has with the big cash cows of the Chinese state. They suffer from that. But in general, they're on a trajectory of improved performance. And on the other hand, they can come to these governments with something that ExxonMobil just can't bring. Arms packages, soft loans, a trip to Beijing, a UN vote, a UN veto, all explicitly guaranteed in certain circumstances. And I came to think, if I were the emir of, Oil Stan, and I happened to rob the bank and win the coup and suddenly found myself in charge, and I trusted my cousins to take care of my security long enough to develop an oil project, what would I do? Would I really turn to the Chinese, or would I invite ExxonMobil in to make a PowerPoint presentation? And I think ExxonMobil basically still has, I would want to listen to them because I think the record would show that they could credibly say to me, or maybe our friends at Statoil could say the same thing, they could credibly say to me, if you go with us, the project is much more likely to come in on time and on budget, and we will actually write the checks that we say we're going to write, and you will get more money faster. Because we will actually perform what we say we're going to do, and there's going to be transparency, and you're going to be able to monitor this. Yes, we're not going to park $300 million in a Swiss bank account for you, and we're not going to let you fly around on our plane, and we're not going to sell you tanks. But what you want is money. You can buy all those things with the money we generate, and if you do business with our less efficient competitors, you're not going to get there because your money's, your oil's offshore, or it's in deep water, or it's hard to produce, or it requires something that we alone still possess. Now, for as long as they can make that argument and win it, they'll be in business, but I think it's harder over a 20-year period.
In West Africa, has ExxonMobil, not for altruistic reasons, but for self-serving reasons, invested in Gates Foundation types of projects, schooling, whatever, clinics?
ExxonMobil does make investments in public health and women's education and other charitable endeavors in the West African countries where it works. They're very cautious, however, about anything that smacks of nation building. They're constantly being strong-armed by their host governments to build hospitals or roads or to do more, and they refuse to do it as part of the same kind of universal contract regime that they follow. I think the most discouraging case overall is in Chad, where Exxon owned some leases that were stranded in the desert in southern Chad, actually where the desert blends into the semi-tropical forests of Cameroon. And they'd never been able to develop that oil because there was no pipeline. And so they brought, in the 90s, the World Bank, the Clinton administration, and others together around this very ambitious experiment in trying to beat the resource curse. The idea was to beat the resource curse by establishing this grand social experiment in which the authoritarian leader, shall we politely call him, of Chad, Idris Deby, would agree to route oil proceeds through a secure bank account in London and spend them only on social development, public health, education, and other agreed allocations. And Exxon benefited from this pact, even though it smacked of nation building of the sort they normally abjure, because it allowed them to get this pipeline financed and to develop the oil. Well, when this project started, Chad, which is a really moving and benighted place, only fortunately 11 million people live there, but it's a pretty miserable place to be, kind of a fourth world country, really. And when this began, they were 171st out of 177 nations on the Human Development Index, the quality of life indicators. Life expectancy in Chad was 46 years when this project began. Well, today, after the production of many billions of dollars in oil revenue out of this social experiment, they're 181st out of 187 countries, and life expectancy is 49 years. And Idris Deby in 2006, 2007, was able to buy his way out of this deal so that he could buy weapons. He essentially broke the compact, and he defied the World Bank president at the time, Paul Wolfowitz, the former Bush administration deputy defense secretary, who challenged him, said, no, we're going to confront you about your attempt to get out of this bargain. And he basically used the extraordinary amount of revenue he had from ExxonMobil to pay the World Bank off and free himself from his obligations and to do what he wanted. And just to give you a sense of what the power of a corporation like ExxonMobil represents in a country like Chad, at the time that he broke the deal, 2006, 2007, the United States Embassy in Chad, one of the world's poorest nations, was delivering in total, and if you include counterterrorism aid to chase notional al-Qaeda guys around the desert in the north, total aid, no more than $10 million a year. And the royalty and tax checks that ExxonMobil was cutting to Idris Deby by 2007 were in excess of $500 million a year. So if you're Idris Deby and you're sitting there and you're looking across, there's the U.S. Embassy, there's the ExxonMobil country representative office, who are you going to call?
Thank you for making ExxonMobil come alive.
Thank you
you very much. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.